All right.
Welcome. I see people coming in. We will get started in about 2 minutes. I'm gonna just give people a chance to get here. We hit over 500 registrations for this, which is crazy. I know a lot of people are going to be registering for the recording, so not all will be live, but we do expect quite a number here.
Letting people join in. We currently have 35 people, attendees. Oop, 37. I think another wave just came in. Welcome, welcome. We are so excited to get started. Appreciate your patience as we allow more people to come in. Just so you're all aware, in a webinar function, none of your mics or your videos will be on. And so you don't have to worry about muting or turning off your video. All of that is taken care of for you. If you want to drop into the chat, you're welcome to do so. Please tell us where you are joining us from. Dallas, Texas. Welcome, Jen. We have Northern California. Oh, my scroll is getting on me. England, India, Seattle, Oregon, Minneapolis, Kansas City, Missouri, Canada, Panama. Hi, Lisa. Thanks for joining us today. Mexico, Brazil, Kalamazoo, Oregon, Korea, Phoenix, Arizona, Orlando, Florida. More people from Texas and Mexico, Canada, Brazil. Tanya is joining us from Australia. Thank you, Tanya, for being here. Minneapolis, Israel, New Zealand, Papua, Indonesia, Pensacola, Florida. Thank you for joining us, Elizabeth Miller. Korea, Brazil, Mexico. Wow, we have a lot of people in Brazil and Mexico and Canada. And also, of course, the United States. I would say that's probably where most of the people are located. Michigan. We currently have 57 people here, and that number is continuously going up.
Yeah, we're going to go ahead and wait about 2 more minutes before we get started and let people have a chance to come in.
More people from Brazil, welcome.
I see someone else here from Australia. Welcome.
Yes, Brisbane, North Carolina. If you guys are new joining us, we are in a webinar feature, which is different from our normal platform where we get to see all of the attendees. So our chat is going to be the #1 place that we can communicate. So I've invited everyone to share where they are from. And we have several people in North Carolina. Welcome. 62 attendees present. And the number keeps rising. Michigan, Illinois. Welcome. Dallas, Georgia. I am also in Georgia, and Lauren too, but we're not in the same place in Georgia. We are so delighted that you're all here. Chicago, welcome. Virginia.
All right. Well, we are about 4 minutes past our starting time, so I hope that's given everybody a chance to get in. I see a couple of people who are now in here who I know are scrambling for the link at the last minute. So we're going to assume that most people have been able to get in today, and we are so excited that you are all here. This is a project that we have spent hundreds of hours on in the last year. It was almost exactly a year ago to the day that I emailed Tanya the first set of draft survey questions and the first kind of here's what I'm thinking we should do with this research email. And so it's really exciting to see that almost exactly a year later, we're now able to present to you some of our findings. So welcome to our presentation on developmental trauma in third culture kids. In the next 90 minutes, which sounds like a long time, but with the amount of information that we had to whittle down to get it into 90 minutes, it is not that long. But we're going to explain our research methodology. This is really important because we want you to know and to hear that we took a lot of measures to make sure that this research was really high quality, that the data is really clean, that there are a lot of things put into place to ensure the quality of this really important data. We didn't want anything that had to do with methodology getting in the way of presenting really excellent data. So we're going to explain that. We'll discuss the participant demographics that we looked into. We'll look at our findings regarding ACE scores and TCKs. So you'll be some of the first to see some of this data that we have analyzed. We'll explain our goals for moving forward, and then we'll have a time of live Q&A at the end. What we ask from you is first that you hold your questions for that live Q&A time at the end. We have had a lot of questions up until this presentation, and we have tailored this presentation to really answer the vast majority of questions that we have received over the last couple of months, especially. So I hope that through this time, your questions will be answered. If by the time we get to the end, they have not been answered, that would be the time to bring them up. We want to hear your questions because we want to make sure that you are understanding the data, how we came to these conclusions, and how we went about finding these things. We may not get to every question in this time together. We will, again, take questions at the end, but keep in mind that there are a lot of people present. And so we may not get to every question, but we'll send out additional answers later. We do want to make sure we're answering the questions that you have. We're going to, for that purpose, submit a form to you all for additional questions, and that will be emailed with a recording. And so you'll get a form where you can ask your questions in there, and we will respond and make sure that there's another email that goes out in the next few weeks responding to all of those additional questions. And then finally, if you have questions about methodology, your answers are probably in the methodology report that Tanya and I labored over and made sure has all the details about the methodology. So before you ask a question about methodology, go read that report, because there's no way we can communicate everything in every sentence of that report in this time together. So about methodology, read the report. If you still have questions, then absolutely submit them to us. We also, on our page on the website, tcktraining.com/research, is where we're housing all of this information. We have a lot of FAQs that we already have answered on there, and we will bring most of those into today's conversation as well. So that's what we ask from you, and we are excited to get started. We want to start with, why are we doing this research? This is something that I have been dreaming about for over a decade. So this is a big deal for me to be here talking to you all about this today, because I hypothesized years and years ago and wrote about it in all three of my books that TCKs experience higher rates of ACE scores, higher rates of developmental trauma than monocultural individuals, especially when we're looking at lifestyle. And we'll talk about that as we go. And it was because of that that I started the concept and the idea of preventive TCK care. The whole premise was that there are things that need to be prevented. And studying prevention science led me to discover that a lot of the things that need to be prevented could usually be categorized in ACE scores and developmental traumas. Those are the things that we see cause struggles in adulthood for anyone. When you have those things take place in your developmental years, you're more likely to struggle with depression, anxiety, physical challenges, mental, emotional challenges, all of these things in adulthood that can be traced back to developmental traumas. And so years ago, I started to wonder, well, what are the rates of those in TCKs and how is that impacting them in adulthood? Because we were seeing anecdotally that adult TCKs were struggling. I remember reading Tanya Crossman's book, Misunderstood, years and years ago, and thinking finally somebody is looking at adult TCKs and how they have responded to what's happened throughout their developmental years. And this is just another piece of that puzzle. So this research gathers data to help us understand the why behind why many adult TCKs aren't thriving, why many of them seem to struggle in adulthood despite the seemingly wonderful life that they grew up with, why they seem to lack some of those benefits that we praise TCKs for, and instead they're not doing well. We want to know why so that we can contribute to lifelong thriving for all TCKs. We want to see thriving TCKs, and our research, as you'll hear over and over, is not at all to say, so raising TCKs is bad. That is absolutely not our goal. Our goal is to say there are amazing benefits that TCKs can have because of this globally mobile upbringing. And we have to come alongside that upbringing with intentional care because there are risks. And so this data shows what those risks are. I am Lauren Wells, if you didn't know that already. I'm the founder and CEO of TCK Training, and TCK Training, for those of you who don't know, started as a blog. It started as me writing articles about preventive TCK care and then grew into a company over the last few years. I'm an adult TCK myself. I spent time in Tanzania, East Africa. And over the past decade, just over a decade, I've been leading TCK programs from pre-field training to debriefing to now doing all the things that we do through TCK Training. And there are a lot of things that we do through TCK Training. I have written 3 books, Raising Up a Generation of Healthy Third Culture Kids, which is all about practical preventive care that parents and caregivers can do. And then the Grief Tower is about processing grief as a TCK and with your TCKs. And then Unstacking Your Grief Tower came out just last year, and that's for adult TCKs who are trying to process what they've gone through. And again, in all 3 books, I've said something to the effect of, it is hypothesized that TCKs tend to experience developmental traumas and higher ACE scores than monocultural individuals, but more research needs to be done on this matter. We are really excited to talk to you about the research that's been done on this matter. Tanya?
And I'm Tanya Crossman. I have recently joined TCK Training in a more permanent position as the Director of Research and Education Services. I'm an adult TCK myself and an adult expat, and in the process of becoming a migrant. The countries I've experienced personally are Australia, the US, China, and Cambodia. I spent the last 16 years working with TCKs and international families cross-sector, so from all different types of expat experiences. As Lauren said, I wrote a book about TCKs, that's Misunderstood, which looked at the perspective of all sorts of different kinds of cross-cultural kids in TCKs. And I have 2 more books underway right now. It has been a joy to work on this research, and I'm very excited to talk to you about it.
Thank you, Tanya. Our primary objective for this research was to obtain quantitative data on adverse childhood experiences, or ACEs, among TCKs with experiences of international mobility, and we wanted to be able to compare it to existing research on ACE scores.
So to be able to do this, we needed to have some clear parameters for our survey. We needed to have black and white questions that people could ask without it being subjective. So the first one was people needed to be over 18 for a few reasons. One, ACE scores ask about what happens during your developmental years, the parameter used in most ACE studies, at least I think all of the studies I've looked at are people under the age of 18, which means you have to be over 18 to be able to answer the questions comprehensively. But also, as part of a duty of care, we can't provide individualized care through a big survey. And so we wanted to make sure that we weren't working with minors. So only people over the age of 18 were able to be taking part. Next was the definition of a third culture kid. There are lots of different definitions for what is a third culture kid. We needed to be able to pick a definition that we could break down through quantifiable black and white questions. That means that the definition that we're using won't fit everybody, but it's necessary to be able to have data that can be replicable and quantifiable. So in this case, we had asked for an international mobility focus. This is partly because we need a limited scope. We can't do everything in one survey. We really want to see additional research done, but in this survey, we're looking at international mobility. So we're looking for people who had a significant cross-cultural experience. We looked at people who had lived outside their passport country for at least 1 year before the age of 18. We'll show you some stats on that in our demographics. The reason we wanted to focus on international mobility was that we have seen a significant impact of dismissed or unseen trauma because international mobility was seen as a bonus and not a source of potential trauma. And so we wanted to look at that particular experience and see what ACE scores look like in that demographic. But we also recognized a few other things that could be at play in this demographic. One is that once you bring international mobility in, you start dealing with borders. When you cross borders, you have differences in legal systems and in social services and in your access to legal care, legal services, and social services. So students who are having problems at home, where there's abuse at home, may not have any recourse to leave to receive social services. They cannot leave the country without that parent's permission, without their passport, without a parent accompanying them, things like that. They may not have access to services depending on what country they're in, because in some countries, the government takes responsibility for minors who are residing there with a different passport. Some countries don't. So there's a whole myriad of things that go along with international mobility when we start talking about adverse childhood experiences. In addition, again, anecdotally working with international schools specifically for me, there can be a bit of a sense that international life is a safe haven, that we've got this bubble that is safe. And I've seen a lot of cases where that hasn't been the case. And we wanted to see, how does this back up in the numbers? We've got lots of anecdotal evidence, lots of stories, but when we get a broad cross-section of the community, what do the numbers look like? What does the hard data look like? Now, we had to draft questions. The first big thing, because we wanted to have data that we could contrast with existing ACE research, we needed to have questions that paralleled that existing research. We needed our questions to mimic those questions. They needed to be the same so that we can compare them. That meant that there were a number of questions in our survey that we didn't draft that language. We took that same language. We made minor changes to that language, but basically it was the same. We've had a lot of questions about the subjective nature of some of those questions. The questions that are referred to generally are taken directly from existing ACE research. In particular, questions referring to neglect. There is a very particular way of asking about childhood neglect in adverse childhood experience research about, did you feel loved? Did you feel special? Did you feel that your family was close? Did you feel, were you ever afraid that your family that you wouldn't have enough food or clothes to wear? As opposed to most of the other questions that are quite objective, quite black and white, yes, no, these questions are quite subjective. There's a clear reason for that though. What we're asking about in these questions, and what the ACE research is asking about in these questions, is what is the child's perceived sense of safety? Does the child believe they are loved? Does the child believe they are safe? Because that has a really dramatic impact on how they interact with their world and on their long-term development. So we ask people not what you now know to be true, but what you felt in that moment. And that goes both ways. We had a couple of people comment that, looking back, I realized that there were significant problems in my family, but at the time I felt safe and loved. So that's how I've answered the survey. So it does go both ways. But often it can be the case that a child may feel that they are in danger of not having enough food or not having enough when, their parents made sure they always had enough, but there was a sense that they were living out of a place of lack. And that's really important. That subjective nature is really important, because often that's where preventive care comes in, because it's not just enough to love kids and make sure they have enough. They need to know and have security in that love and in that provision. The other changes we made to those existing ACE questions was we made some adjustments in the instructions about who is your household members. Most ACE research talks specifically about family members and extended family members. So maybe your grandparents live with you, those are household members. We wanted to make it more clear that anyone who lives in your home is a household member, even if they're not related to you, because a lot of TCKs have had the experience of having household staff who live with them, especially housekeepers or nannies or even cooks who live in the family home and who take on significant caregiving roles. And these people, for the purposes of ACE scores, are household members because they are daily in the person's life, they are in their home, they are part of the family's daily life. And when you talk to third culture kids and adult third culture kids about their childhoods, and we got this in comments, that for some third culture kids, these relationships were closer and they felt more loved by than by their own parents. So it was really important to us to make it clear that they counted as their household members. So yeah, we changed some of that. Now, once we had drafted our questions, we went through an extensive period of peer review and testing. We actually spent 3 months drafting questions, reviewing them and testing them. We brought together a group of experts from relevant fields. This included 2 PhD active academics who work in research. It included a child psychologist, included several therapists, counselors and psychologists who work primarily with expats and third culture kids, included international educators and educational consultants. And we had them look through our draft questions and give us feedback. And we got significant feedback and made significant changes to our survey based on their feedback. One of the big things we did was we added much deeper introductions to questions and explanations of questions. We added much better support, because we're asking people to talk about really difficult and emotional experiences. And so we created a list of resources they could go to if they wanted more support, if they wanted to go somewhere with that. We made it clear that this is completely optional. You don't have to take this. You don't have to continue if you feel at all upset. But at multiple points through the survey, they were given a series of resources available in different countries, in different parts of the world, so they could find support if they needed to. as part of our duty of care. Once we had gone through this peer review process, made significant changes to the format and the wording of the survey, we then did beta testing. We had about 30 adult TCKs from a wide variety of experiences from different countries, different backgrounds, different types of experiences, those with very significant traumas, those with really positive backgrounds. And we had them all just with very little intro, just take the survey, tell us what you think. And again, we found some bugs, we found some stuff to change. They told us this bit wasn't clear. We went through, made more changes. Once all of those adjustments were in and we had a survey that was working, that everyone was happy with, we were ready to launch, and we launched at the end of June after a 3-month period of drafting, review and testing. We had the survey open for 6 months from the end of June to the end of December. We promoted on social media and through individual connections, through our newsletter. We reached out to individuals with significant sway in different sectors. We had specific graphics, specific information for specific sectors. So we reached out to different communities, to the military community, to the diplomatic corps, to international educators, to the mission community, to international schools and business families. We made graphics about which age groups we were seeing gaps in our responses. And over those 6 months, we received 2,377 responses. Now, we haven't used all of those. We went through then a process of, once we closed the survey, a process of taking those responses through a list of exclusion criteria to make sure that we had a quality data set. So first, one of our criteria was that people be over 18 years old. We had a couple of different layers to ensure that. And if people had, said, yes, I'm over 18, but then went in and actually put their birth year as actually they weren't, that caught another 35 that were taken out of the data set. We only wanted complete responses because we wanted to make sure that we are comparing like against like. So if people only answered half the survey, we took them out. If they only answered 1 or 2 questions and navigated out, well, maybe they went and did it again, things like that. So unless it was a complete response, they didn't have to fill in the optional stuff. They didn't have to put a comment at the end, but as long as they answered all of the ACE questions and the developmental trauma questions, we'd accept it. But that left us with 419 that were not complete and were taken out of the data set. Then we had the TCK definition. This is where we had to go through about nearly 40 responses individually and read through their responses on the demographic questions to work out, does this experience fit our definition? Because as I said, it gets a little tricky. So out of about 40 that we looked at individually who said they had not spent time outside their passport country, we ended up accepting some, about half of them, and 19 were excluded. The ones that we did included a couple of people who were dual citizens and living between countries. So they definitely had that international mobility that was very important to our survey. But most of them, it became clear as we read through the results that they had made a mistake when they said they'd lived 0 years, and they actually meant they'd lived 0 years inside their passport country when we read the rest of the responses. So that's why a lot of this individual checking was really important. We wanted to make sure that everyone's voice was heard. Next, we checked for repeat responses and found 0. So none of the responses in our data set were identical. That left us with 1,904 responses that we accepted into our data set. So out of that 2,377, we ended up with 1,904 that we used for all of our statistics. Now, there are some potential risks with this data. The first one, unknowing repeat responses. We don't think there are any unknowing repeat responses in our data set. Firstly, our survey software recognizes if the same IP address takes the survey more than once. If the same IP address comes in again, it recognizes them and says, do you want to edit your survey? It won't let you take the survey more than once from the same IP. Then we also went through to look for repeat responses and found no identical responses. Next is the risk of malicious responses. So people going in and just putting in nonsense answers to mess with our data set. We think this is a fairly low risk, partly because 44% of people left optional comments or put their email address in for us at the end of the survey. They completed the survey and then optionally put in comments or an email address because they want to be connected to the survey. So you did not have to leave an email address, but a lot of people did. Then when I went and looked at, so that's 719 people who left an email address. Of those 719 people, the ACE scores were much higher. So if we only looked at the scores that were identified, we actually get a much higher ACE scores. So by looking at the full data set, we actually get a much more balanced picture in the research. So we're quite happy with that. And finally, human error is our final potential risk, because there is a lot of work being done in our data analysis that is individual. So looking at some of this stuff individually, in particular, the ACE scores were individually calculated for each of the 1,904 respondents. We looked at the 10 questions of the 10 ACE factors and assigned them an ACE score. Every one of those 1,904 were calculated and then reviewed with a second calculation. We've done random checks since then and have never found an error in those random checks. So we're fairly confident that there's no human error problem in our research scores. And as Lauren said before, there is much more detailed information on all of this in our methodology report, which you can find on our website. Next up, we want to tell you a little bit about the demographics. So we asked a number of demographic questions, partly so we knew who was taking the survey and partly because it was going to allow us to compare results in different groups. So we asked about sector, so the primary reason for living abroad. We asked about the core education type. We asked about their year of birth, the number of years they lived abroad, the number of countries they lived in, and more about their experiences of mobility. So the number of location moves and the number of house moves. For sector and education type, we asked them both their primary experience and all of their experiences, because these days, especially international experiences, can be quite mixed. So maybe you spend a couple of years, in the military, and then you also have an experience as a business family or as a diplomat family. And so it's not as simple as one or the other. So we asked them to choose what's the primary one that you identify with, and then everything that you've experienced. So for our demographics, we're using the primary core experience that people identified, but we also have data on the full spectrum of what people have experienced. So I'm going to show you a few charts and statistics that we've pulled. First up, on sector. As you can see, more than 50% of the people who took the survey were from the mission field. So that was 1,068 people. Still leaves 836 who were non-mission. Because of that big split in almost every bit of data we do, I look at mission and non-mission to see where we have any differences, because sometimes there's a big difference, sometimes there's not. Also, every subsection we do will be at least 100 people, which means you'll see us often do an edu NGO group, which is where we've combined people in the education sector and the NGO sector, because neither of them were quite 100 on their own, so we've combined them. Here you can see education types, and I've done the everybody and the non-mission, so you can see there's a big change there. In the total group, it's fairly evenly spread, but when you take the mission group out, huge difference, because the percentage in Christian international schools, boarding school and homeschool shrinks dramatically. And we have more than 50% in international schools, more than a third in local schools. And that's the primary experiences people have of education. Next up is age. Here, mission wasn't a big difference, but the military group was a really divergent group. So the military group we had, which was 269 people, was much older than the rest of the group, and old enough to skew the overall results. On the next slide, you can see that if we take the military stats out, our total versus non-military, the non-military group is much younger. So when you take the military out, 50% were born 1990 or more recently, so are 30 or younger, basically 32. Yeah, so that's good to know. And we're okay with that because it means we've got a lot of stats on people who are living this experience more recently. But it's good to know that that's there. Time abroad, again, the military were the outlier here, with much less time abroad than the typical rest of the group. But in this case, it wasn't enough to really change the overall total group scores. Countries lived in, diplomats were the outliers here, again, not quite enough to change the overall, but half the group had only lived in 1 or 2 countries, which meant half had lived in 3 or more. And mobility. Here, the different sectors were all over the map. Different schooling, different sectors, different ages, like just all over the map. So the general averages were the easiest to look at here. So we have both location moves and house moves here. I used some of these statistics recently talking about TCKs in transition with our pathways course, because what is really significant here is, you know, if if a third of our TCKs are changing locations 9+ times, that's every 2 years on average for a third of TCKs that they're changing locations. A third of them are changing houses 11+ times, 10+ times. You know, the impact of the build up of that much transition is significant. It's not just one move, it's the combination over time that we want to really pay attention to here.
So thank you for explaining all of our demographics and methodology, Tanya. Tanya has been leading this research and she has been spending hours upon hours analyzing this data. So she's kind of the data encyclopedia at the moment. I ask her a question and she says something like, oh yeah, 1,203 said, which is really great. So we wanted to explain why we're looking at ACE scores specifically. One of the primary reasons is that this is a common language in the prevention science field. So if we are talking with those who work in preventive care for anybody, not just TCKs, but preventive care for children, they're going to talk about ACE scores. They're going to talk about preventing ACE scores. And so when we're trying to really bring the TCK research into a broader community and say, this is why we need to pay attention to them, this is why this is important, it's really helpful to have common language to make those comparisons and say, and here's why. It also allows us to compare to current research. The ACE score research has been done extensively in multiple different countries all around the world. And that's important to us because we don't want something that's just an American idea or something that's just from a different place around the world that was only done in this small group. We wanted to compare it against something that is really widely known and has been really well researched over time. This ACE score research has been done since the early 90s. And so we know that it has stood the test of time and that that's something we want to be able to compare to. Another reason is that the ACE scores and the prevention of them are directly correlated to positive childhood experiences. This is something we won't get into here, but we teach a lot about what are called PIECES or positive childhood experiences and the experiences that children need during their developmental years in order to thrive in adulthood and in order to combat and counteract adverse experiences. And so what we see in research, not our research, but external research that's been done on ACE scores and PIECE scores, ACEs and PIECES is what they're called, is that the more ACE scores you have and the more PIECES you have, those things can counteract each other. And so even if you have a high ACE score, but you have a lot of these positive childhood experiences, you're less likely to be negatively impacted by that high ACE score. But if you have a higher ACE score and you have lower pieces, that's not going to be a healthy outcome. There's going to be a lot of work to do to be healthy in adulthood. And so we wanted to look at what that looks like for our TCKs, because we advocate for parents and caregivers and those loving and supporting TCKs to come alongside them and prioritize these pieces, these positive childhood experiences, because we believe that when you have these pieces present, that the hard things that they go through that we'll look at in a minute, those hard things that can't be prevented, some of them, they become resilience building. So when you have pieces combined with the hard things, they're building resilience by getting through those hard things. But when you have these hard developmental traumas and you don't have those pieces, that is fragility building. That knocks them down farther every time something else hard comes along. And that continues on into adulthood. And that is what we want to ultimately prevent.
So an ACE score is made up of 10 factors, which gives you a score of 0 to 10. And the score of 4 or more is a risk factor, as Lauren's been talking about, for different conditions. And there are lots of ACE scores studies out there. And we are just in the initial phases of doing all of our comparison and data analysis. So for now, we're using the large CDC Kaiser study of 17,000 Americans, which was one of the early pieces of research done as our main comparison point. So we're going to be comparing our findings to that study through a lot of the rest of this. But as Lauren said, that's not the only one out there, and we'll be doing more as we go. So these are the ACE scores from our study. 26.5% of our 1,904 adult TCKs had an ACE score of 0. 21.9% had 1. 16.6% had a score of 2. 14.5% had a score of 3. 7.9% had a score of 4. And then 6.8% had a score of 5. And then 6, 7, 8. We even had someone with a score of 9 in this data set. Now, when we compare this to the CDC Kaiser study, you can see that in that study of Americans, 36% had a score of 0 compared to our 26%, and 12.5% had a score of 4+ compared to our survey with 20.4% having a score of 4+. So we do definitely see higher ACE scores in our group. Now, when you look at the individual factors, what we see is interesting is that where those high ACE scores are coming from is different. So in the US study, those with high ACE scores, that was often being driven by seeing a mother or stepmother being abused, by parents separating, parents being or a household member being incarcerated, using drugs, recreational drugs or alcohol, abusing alcohol, things like that. Whereas in our study, what was largely driving the high ACE scores was emotional neglect and emotional abuse, and someone in the household suffering mental illness. Those were the 3 largest driving factors of ACE scores amongst our TCKs. There are also higher rates of sexual abuse, which is significant as well. Now, we've also laid this out by sector. So in this chart, you can see CDC Kaiser study versus our totals, non-mission, and then all of those different sectors. We will be presenting all of this research and more in our forthcoming white paper. But for now, I'm just going to point out a few key things here. You can see here that emotional neglect and emotional abuse across the board were much higher, which is where the importance of pieces come in. You know, it's going to be really important that TCKs have positive childhood experiences to go along with this. And on the next one, we see the next slide, we see the series of ones that are very different, where, you know, far fewer families experiencing divorce and separation, fewer families experiencing a parent being abused, but far more experiencing mental illness. Now, this actually was not unexpected by us. Existing research shows that expats have a 2.5 times rate of depression and anxiety than monocultural populations. There's research on large, I think it was around 3,000 expats that showed that. So we're seeing this being reflected in the ACE factors of the children, that those stresses are passed on. Now, when we look at high and low ACE scores by sector, we see one thing that really stands out is that the mission sector had lower ACE scores generally, had fewer high risk factors. Now, that was mostly driven by lower rates of alcohol and drug abuse and lower rates of divorce and separation. On the surface, people might attribute that to, well, religious people doing the religious thing. I actually think that's maybe partly it, though if people are not divorcing because religion says so, it actually tends to result in an unhealthy childhood environment, so you would see that pushed out in other ways. I think what personally, in my cross-sector work, I've worked with all of these different sectors. I've been brought in to work with all of these different groups, and across the board, the mission groups are the ones who are investing the largest portion of their income on TCK care, and are the most interested in resources for TCKs. And I think there's more preventive care happening in the mission groups. And personally, I suspect that that's part of why we're seeing lower ACE scores there. On the next slide, I have compared the ACE scores of the ones with the lowest score, the mission group, and the highest scores, the business group. And you can see there's a stark difference from the highest to lowest sector there. This one shows the difference in education. And we see big difference in Christian schools, boarding schools, home schools, but we already knew that those were mostly populated by missionary kids. So that's driving that. Again, I've compared the highest to lowest, not quite as dramatic, but the Christian international schools had the lowest ACE scores, local schools had the highest ACE scores. Then by age, where it's much flatter, there's less of a change there, but all across the board, significantly different to the CDC Kaiser study. I did just want to point out the mission factor across age. When you take out the mission stats from the total and look at the non-mission stats, you can see there's a much bigger difference there. And also that there's no clear pattern happening. It's a bit all over the place. Whereas there seems to be a downward trend happening by age. And when you look at the mission alone, it seems to be dropping off even more sharply if you look at those mission kids born after 2000. So there's hope that that is a continuing trend as more energy is being poured into TCK care in that mission sector. What we want to see is that downward trend happening across all sectors.
Yes, which leads us to our practical application. What do we do with this data? There is so much of it. And as Tanya mentioned, we're only in the beginning stages of our analysis. There are pages upon pages and graphics upon graphics of analysis that has already happened, that we've been combing through, and Tanya has been working really hard on. And so we're curious to see even more things that show up that may surprise us or confirm some things that we had hypothesized. But we want to talk about how we practically apply this. One of the ways that we hope that this is applied is by communicating risks to parents and other caregivers, not to scare them. This is not meant to be something where we're trying to instill fear, but we do want to say this is a risk, and these ACEs need to be either prevented if prevention is possible, Or if it's not possible to completely mitigate those risks, we need to come alongside them with those pieces. It emphasizes why prioritizing these positive childhood experiences is critical. We also want to communicate risks to those who are in authority to advocate for the need for TCK care, whether it's leadership in military, in business, in international schools, in NGOs, in the missions community. They need to hear that TCKs need support. The reason why we hypothesize the missionary kids tend to be trending a bit better, still they have significantly higher ACE scores than our monocultural individuals do in the CDC study. But the reason we hypothesize that they do is because that is also the sector that tends to receive the most care and the most intention to caring for the children. In those other sectors, perhaps that's not as much of a priority. And we really need to advocate for the fact that it needs to be, and here's the data to show why. We also know that those other sectors tend to be more data driven. And so one of our hopes for this is that the numbers get that attention, that they advocate for TCKs through showing here is what we have seen happen to these kids who grow up in the globally mobile environment without intentional care. And then finally, we want to develop and continue to develop evidence-based care approaches for TCKs. This is something we've been doing all along, is developing preventive care resources, but we haven't been able to call them research-based. We haven't been able to say that they're evidence-based because we haven't had this data. And so when we continue to develop these resources and to help others in other sectors and others working in TCK care to develop resources, we want to be able to show and say, this is based on this evidence. This isn't just a neat idea. This isn't just something that we hope is needed. This is something that is really, really important. So next month, we have a white paper coming that Tanya is working on, and this white paper will show a more detailed approach to our data analysis and statistics. So we'll have more detailed information about how that was laid out, about how we went about that, about the analysis that Tanya has been doing, and a lot more information on what that means. This time today has been showing you the methodology and some of the statistics, but we haven't dug into a lot of, okay, so what does this mean? What do these statistics mean? And that's what we're going to be doing as we publish a lot more academic articles and a lot more layman articles over the next year and probably years after. We also will show in that white paper a more detailed comparative on ACE scores in different demographics. We feel like that's really important to piece out those different demographics by, again, sector, age, schooling type, so that we can be more specific about, we're not just saying blanket statement, all TCKs deal with this, but we're able to say military kids in this sort of environment tend to have these rates of ACE scores, and here's the type of ACE scores, and so here's how we can apply then preventive care. And as we have mentioned, but it's worth mentioning a third time, the methodology report is on the website, so please go read it if you have any questions about that. So our primary objective was the ACE scores, and that is what we just discussed. That was what we came into the study saying, we want to find out ACE scores and compare them with the current research on monocultural individuals. One thing that we did not note that I think is important to note is that the ACE scores that we found for TCKs, they compare with monocultural individuals, but the monocultural individuals who tend to have higher ACE scores also come from a very different family life. They often come from families who are lower socioeconomic status, who have abusive families, who have a lot of things going on that make them more at risk for higher ACE scores, whereas our TCKs tend to come from a more seemingly privileged family environment. They come from loving parents who care for them well. And so even that discrepancy of what kinds of families are these children coming from is an interesting thing that we'll be looking into more as well. But our secondary objective was to see what different developmental traumas came out through this study. We wanted to create open-ended questions. We wanted to ask for them to give things in the comments that they may have had as an experience of a developmental trauma. And so we asked for those things. because this is a very fluid idea of developmental traumas, it's not as black and white as these ACE score questions. We had less clearly defined parameters, and we had no specific hypothesis to prove. We just wanted to see, we were curious, what other types of developmental traumas do TCKs say that they've experienced, and what can we learn from this? And so it reveals more about various traumas that were experienced and at what rates. So what were the different types of traumas, and then how common were they? And it ultimately opens avenues for future research. We don't anticipate this to be the only research study we do. And this, again, kind of narrow focus on ACE scores was the first objective. Our secondary objective is a lot more broad. And the reason for that, one of them, is to open up avenues for researching more in the future.
Yeah, we had some ideas of what we might see. We had some questions that were coming up, even as we were talking to our experts about what they would like to see more research done on. And also, even as we put the ACE scores in, we're like, it's asking this, but it's not asking this. We feel like there needs to be a question about that to make it more comprehensive. So we just threw in a whole bunch of questions to be like, okay, well, let's just see what TCKs resonate with, and that will give us an idea of where we can go with future research. So we've got a bunch of stuff in there. The ACE scores only ask about sexual assault from a person, an adult or someone 5 years older than you, which is a fairly narrow experience of what's out there. So we added an extra question about sexual harm from someone who is, less than 5 years older than you. We added a question about grooming behaviours. That's something that's been quite concerning in the international school sector in particular. So we asked about those experiences. We asked about other household stresses, such as, people within the household experiencing chronic illness, medical crises, or death. We asked about violent events such as home invasions, or, armed robberies where you were present, or something that happened in your community when you weren't there. We asked about being impacted by war, natural disaster, evacuation, and witnessing violence, death, or extreme poverty, things like that. We also had a lot of comments about traumas that weren't mentioned, people saying, I had nowhere to talk about this experience. And there were a lot of comments talking about secondary trauma, saying, this didn't happen to me, I didn't witness it, but it's something that happened in my community, happened to my friends, it was something that I was aware of and had fear of because it was an objective reality in my life. So that's definitely something we'd love to address in future research. So first up, we have stats on childhood sexual harm. On the left there is sexual abuse, and that's the one that is an ACE score. And so, we saw that those rates were higher than in the CDC Kaiser study. What was really interesting there was the rates of grooming were quite high. It was close to a third of TCKs that experienced grooming behaviour, and it was very high in the education and NGO sector. Next, we have household illness and death. Huge rates of people saying that it experienced medical crisis, which is, it's not that doesn't happen in other contexts, but it's when we're talking about the sort of things happening in households, this is also part of what's happening. And again, we're talking about international mobility. When medical crisis happens in an internationally mobile family, that is often also accompanied with additional transition traumas. So it may precipitate needing to leave the country that is the child's home to get treatment elsewhere. Or it might involve other people coming, or a parent having to go. All sorts of other things can go with medical crisis. So that's actually a particularly interesting one to pay attention to. We asked about if an adult or child in the household passed away, and it was around 10% of people who experienced that. We also asked if a caretaker adult had passed away, specifically, because that's a second core experience. We asked also about violent harm, if anyone had suffered violent harm in the family. And then we asked about being directly impacted by violent events. So was your home broken into, was there a home invasion when you were not present? Close to 30% of mission kids said that had happened to them. On a lot of these, military kids in particular had very low scores, which makes sense as many of them lived on military bases that had very high security. Whereas the mission kids, diplomat kids, and the education and NGO kids tended to have higher rates of these kind of events. We asked about being present during a home invasion. Again, those three groups had higher rates. About sort of armed invasion, robbery, a violent event at school when you were present. Then we asked about community events. So did a violent event, an armed event happen somewhere in your community when you were present, or somewhere that you regularly go when you weren't present? We thought that was a really important one to ask, because that adds to that sense of fear and security that somewhere I go, this could happen, even if it didn't happen to you personally. So if the mall that you normally go to, an event happened when you weren't there, that would still have a very lasting impact. And again, we saw quite high rates in those three particular groups, three particular sectors. We are only just scratching the surface of this. So this is just some very, very initial findings. We need to score this by age and all kinds of things. But yeah, this is just a little sneak peek, really. We also asked about being impacted by war, political corruption, natural disaster, evacuation. And then we asked, have none of these been an impact for you? What we see here is that for 2/3 of TCKs, at least one of those has been a direct impact for them. So they've been directly impacted by war, political corruption, natural disaster, or evacuation. 2/3 of TCKs have been impacted by at least one of those. That's significant. And then we asked them about things that they witnessed, that they saw happen. About 2/3, actually a bit more, closer to 3/4, had witnessed at least one of these. Physical violence, the example was like watching a child be beaten, armed conflict, murder, or another traumatic death of a person, extreme poverty, or a serious traffic accident. So 3/4 of TCKs have witnessed at least one of those. Again, the scores generally were much lower for military kids and higher for missionary kids.
So what are our goals moving forward? Our ultimate goal is thriving TCKs. No, that's a really big and in some ways subjective goal, but our ultimate goal is thriving TCKs. In the future, we want to see lower ACE scores in TCKs. We hope and pray that we can do this research again in 10 years and see that the rates have dropped because of more intentional care. That is our hope. We also want to recognize that each TCK is an individual. We are looking at stats to see trends. We're looking at this data to see the things that we can say this is an experience for the average TCK or many of these TCKs, but we also need to recognize that each TCK is an individual and come alongside them in that individualistic sense. We also want to make sure that we communicate that every TCK experience is valid and every TCK's voice deserves to be heard. This is not only the voices of the TCKs who experienced trauma. We also want to hear from the TCKs who had great experiences and say, tell us about that. What made that a great experience for you? What did you notice from these pieces that you had, and how did that maybe contribute to your great experience? We want to communicate that all of those experiences are valid and important.
We have for you a bunch of quotes from the comments that we got that are paired, because we want you to see that there are two sides to this. So for example, we have two business kids here born 2 years apart. One saying, not everyone is tortured by their past. Some people just had a happy childhood. Yes, that's great. And that's what we want to see for all TCKs, which is why we're doing this. On the other hand, we have someone saying, I can tell just by the questions that I'm not alone in my experiences. Thank you. That's also what we want to do. We want TCKs to feel that their experiences are heard. We have two great quotes here from two different military kids. One saying, I absolutely love my army brat life. I wouldn't change it for anything. I keep up with dozens of high school classmates who feel the same way. Where are you finding all this trauma? again, that is so wonderful to hear. And yet we have someone else saying that lots of child molestation happen to military dependents. I think a disproportionate amount. Very, very disturbing. As an adult, I have been very surprised not to hear more about this phenomena. So both of these are valid. Both of these stories are real. We have here 2 missionary kids born in the same year. One saying, no matter how crazy the world around me was, my parents made it clear to me I had the power to take us home. Feeling I had the control made all the difference. And another saying, my parents refused to acknowledge I struggle with the things I've gone through and won't help me. And this to me speaks to these pieces that we're talking about. We want to make sure kids are having positive childhood experiences. We have here a diplomat kid and an education kid with really important contributions to the discussion. The diplomat kid saying, while I understand the need to compare with non-TCK ACEs, I found it did not touch upon the many fears, uncertainties, verbal aggressions and perpetrations imprinted in my childhood. Exactly why we want to do more research into these additional developmental traumas that many TCKs experience. And another kid, an education kid saying, I teach in international schools, having been the child of international school teachers. Child safeguarding is a part of my job, while also knowing that sometimes there are little local resources to support a child. And that's part of what we're talking about in international mobility. There are just different resources when you're moving across borders. I love these 2 quotes because they represent what a lot of people were saying about taking the survey and reflecting on their childhood as adults. One of the younger ones represented here saying, I never thought about my childhood in this way before. It's making me think about my life more and how traumatic childhood events are affecting me now. And this is why we need adults to take these surveys, because as a child, you don't really think about it. The second one he's saying, I honestly did not realize how traumatic my childhood was until I was an adult and in counseling. As a kid, I viewed the frequent moves as my only source of trauma. And I think our last one here, which I think really sum up a lot of what we're doing. One saying, answering these questions helped me reinforce to me that I'm not crazy to think I carry PTSD from childhood trauma. And finally, beautiful way to sum up, living abroad has been an intense experience filled with lots of love and sorrow at the same time. Absolutely agree.
So going forward, we want to develop practical ways that caregivers can prevent these developmental traumas. We just wrapped up a second edition of our Preventive TCK Care video series. And that video series even looks at some of these and compares them to how we can use these to look at practical ways to prevent these ACE scores, these developmental traumas. So we want to keep doing that. We want to keep making this really practical. We want to develop a tailored care framework that calculates risks based on demographics. We have this saying at TCK training that not all TCKs should be treated equal. And what we mean by that is nothing of malintent. What we mean by that is that we have to look at risk factors and then look at preventive care based on those risk factors. If we know that they are more at risk for some of these things, that should increase the level of care they're receiving. That should increase the amount of preventive care they're getting. And then we want to educate widely on the measurable challenges of the TCK life so that we can offer hope through a preventive care approach. Again, we are not saying all of this should say that you should not raise TCKs. That's not at all what we are communicating. What we're saying is the TCK life is an incredible one. The globally mobile life is amazing. And we need to have hope through preventive care. We need to look at the TCKs that are adults who are not thriving and hear their voices so that we can turn around to the younger TCKs coming behind them and help them to thrive, help them to have a different and better experience. But we can't do this alone. We want to share these results and we want to collaborate. This research has not been done so that we can keep it to ourselves and only have it for our use. That is not the purpose of this at all, which is why we are having this presentation and why we presented this at the Families in Global Transition Conference a few weeks ago. And that's why we're putting these things out there and never behind a paywall. We want this to be stuff and information and data that people have access to so that it can influence how care for TCKs is done. We're currently working with several organizations, including those involved in child safety and protection, and in education, and in transitions for families. We want these groups to be able to use this information so that we can care better for TCKs. So that is the information that we have for you. We acknowledge that it is like drinking from a fire hose and that there's a lot of information there. But if you have any questions at this point, now would be the time to ask. You are welcome to put your questions in the chat or to put them in the Q&A function that should be on your list of options. And we have a bit of time to answer questions, and I see some coming in.
I saw a question there from Eddie. Eddie, I love that you're here. Hi. If you don't know Eddie Silver, she wrote an amazing book on third culture kids, the children of international school educators. That's on some of my resource lists, and she wrote one of the reviews for my book. And she's asking about respondents in the educational kid, the ed kid category. We aren't able to do official stats on just that group because we had not quite 100 of them, which is why we've combined them with the NGO kids. Because if we have less than 100, we don't feel statistically that's not enough to be really comparing it against the other groups. We had the scores up there for them. Let me just go double check that for you. I have too many scores. Okay, so their scores were reasonably good. A scores of 0 were only 22%, but 4+ were 19.3%. So slightly better, I guess, than average, but yeah, pretty close to the average.
Now I'm seeing a couple of questions on how we recommend advocating for TCKs. So that is what TCK training is all about. So we do a lot of trainings for parents and for caregivers on that topic. And there are a lot of ways to advocate for TCKs, but some of the main ways are encouraging those who are caring for them to prioritize those positive childhood experiences, which we'll just quickly tell you have a lot to do with having friends who are consistent, having feeling heard and believing that your family stands by you, and being able to talk openly about emotions within the family. There are a lot of those pieces, there's 7 of them that we recommend families do, along with advocating for TCKs by knowing some of the unique challenges that TCKs deal with and how we can come alongside them preventively.
I see a question about, was number of moves correlated with ACE scores? We don't know yet because we haven't finished doing the things, but that will be in the white paper when it comes out next month.
Mm-hmm.
Also, are the children globally mobile scientists included in business? It depended on how how the individual respondent identified, but usually they would be. They had the choice between, do I identify as, were they teaching, were they studying, were they working? If they were working, they would probably have gone in business. In the secondary, all your different experiences, most of them would have identified. There were definitely some people who identified specifically what sector they were working in. And I remember there being a couple in there talking about research and scientists. But yes, most of those would have ended up in business. Was there any kind of control group among monocultural kids using the same questions? For the ACE scores, absolutely. There are lots of ACE studies. That's why we were so careful about the wording of that. because there are existing ACE studies with monocultural kids worldwide, which we'll be comparing to, and I've already started to compare to.
Jerry asked if there are countries or regions throughout the world that have recorded more traumatic for TCKs. We did not do any demographics specifically by location. And the reason for that is that got really complicated when you had lots of these TCKs who lived in lots of different locations to be able to ask questions and say, wait, so what country were you in when these things happened? What country were you in when these things happened? And that got too messy. So that was something that we considered, and that was something that we moved away from because we weren't going to get clean data from that type of an analysis, but it would be an interesting thing to look at studying in the future.
What we did do, we haven't done the analysis on this yet, but we did ask about number of years, we gave them a few options, spent in countries that were considered developed by the UN. Is it the OECD? We gave a link to that in the survey, where there was a lot of questions about that because it's so arbitrary. It feels to us arbitrary how the UN classifies those countries. There were countries that we would consider developed that weren't on that list. So we have got that data, but we're a little unsure how useful it's going to be, but we will work on that in the future. There's a question about sexual abuse and sexual harm. Sexual abuse was the question defined by the ACE scores, so someone who is an adult or 5 years older than you. Sexual harm is basically the same stuff, but with child to child. Those are just the labels we've used for the chart. It'll be more clearly explained in written papers.
There's so many questions coming in. I'm filtering. A lot of people are asking about pieces and if they're directly linked for TCKs. Pieces are not specifically for TCKs, they're for all children. You can Google pieces, positive childhood experiences, and read more information about those. We did not compare or ask anything about pieces in our study. That was another question, but we talk about pieces all the time in our TCK training workshops, the Raising Healthy TCKs workshop, as well as most other workshops. We bring up pieces again because they're so important.
I see someone in the chat has asked, saying, I participated in the survey. How would I find out what ACE score I got when you calculated my info? You can actually just take an ACE score inventory online and you'll get the same score. aces2high.com is one that is, pretty much identical wording than we use. And yeah, the only difference from ours to that one is that we also included, it only includes with parental abuse to a parent, abuse to a mother or stepmother. We looked at both mother, stepmother, and father, stepfather, so to either of your parents. Overall, for our results, that didn't have a massive difference. It added an extra ACE score to 35 people out of 1,904. But we felt that it was important to recognize that both mothers or fathers can be victims of domestic abuse. There's a question here about witnessing corruption as trauma. How we address the cultural element of this. For example, I grew up in a country where most likely 100% of children will have witnessed corruption occurring, and so the score to this question will be meaningless. Yeah, really good point. As I said, in the developmental trauma, we're really just kind of seeing what's out there. We're not sure. The ACE scores are where we're like, this is the hard data. The developmental trauma is more like, this is where we'd like to do more research later. So I don't have a good answer for that, honestly. You know, we framed the question as, are these things that, you know, directly impacted you? And the question was framed as political violence or corruption. So, you know, it was kind of left up to the individual to how they would, you know.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and there are some studies that have been done that look at the witnessing of extreme poverty and corruption as developmental traumas. And so even considering how they define those and the effect that that has versus what we're seeing in TCKs, again, it's an area for more research to be done. A couple of questions for you, Tanya. Joey asked, has the study broken down T test group stats between both male and female respondents? Have you done that?
Short answer is no.
Not yet. Short answer is no. Let's see. The survey is not available in more than the English language, and we did not ask if they were native English speakers. So that is not an element that we were looking for. Let's see.
There was a question here about, is there a reason you suspect as to why experience of medical emergencies or chronic illness in the household is higher in the missions community? Like I said, the data we were presenting there is very, very initial first things. We haven't checked that by any other factor yet. So it may be that the correlation is actually to the number of years overseas, it might be to age, it might be something else. So yeah, we'll have to see as we go. Yeah, I can't answer that yet. We don't have enough data yet.
Sarah asked, how did you go about locating TCKs within the various demographics you shared? So the first answer to that is that both Tanya and myself, under the name TCK Training, and then also just Tanya herself, are fairly well known in the TCK care world. And so that is helpful because as we were posting on social media, we know that we're getting a lot of respondents that way because we have a decently large following. We also know a lot of other people in this TCK care world who we were able to reach out to and say, hey, please share this in your community and in your specific sector that these are located in. So it was a lot of personal relationships that we know are influential in a lot of these different communities. And so that was a very helpful way to access those adult TCKs in various demographics.
Yeah, it's definitely about those relationships. And I've had this question repeatedly from people who have had trouble getting respondents to surveys. I'm like, how did you get 2,000 people to take a survey? Well, you know, I've been building a network for 15 years. It's the short answer. There's no shortcut to building those networks. It's getting to know people and working with those people over time. I spent years interviewing hundreds of TCKs who know me, who trust me, who will share this with other TCKs in their various sectors. And as I said, you know, we created graphics tailored to specific groups. We interviewed and got quotes from influential people in those sectors talking about why this survey was important and shared that. We came up with shareable posts with those quotes, with links, with information about the survey that were getting shared in groups on various different social medias, making it easy for people to say, hey, I did this, do you want to take it as well? We would give it to people who are in different groups. So in military groups on Facebook, in different sort of embassy connected groups, in different international educator networks, and different social medias, not just Facebook, but Instagram and Twitter and LinkedIn, where there's different types of groups of people. But yeah, I mean, it came down to relationships eventually.
Yeah, absolutely. John asked about how age influences understandings of the way that TCKs perceive childhood trauma, that it's not until midlife that maybe they can see those effects. And so could that have influenced the stats? The answer is yes, absolutely. And that's also why we divided the demographics by age group, so that we can see that, so that we can look at that and make those hypotheses. We won't be able to say this is exactly why this is lower here or higher here, but we can hypothesize based on those things and separate out those age groups for that purpose. And so that's something that we want to make sure that we're continuing to analyze.
Yeah, and as much as possible, we wanted to have the black and white questions. Did this happen or not happen, rather than what was your,
Perception.
what do you feel like you experienced trauma is not something we were asking so much. That's the reason that the ACE score questions are written in a very specific way. 8 out of 10 are very black and white, and the 2 that are subjective are about how did you feel as a child, not how do you perceive it now. So as much as possible, the ACE score questions, well, even though they are fairly black and white, they are also the same across multiple studies, so that helps. But yes, I do agree that we've had some conversations within our team about this. Is there an impact of rose-colored glasses looking back? Because in a lot of areas, the ACE scores have gone up with time in a lot of sectors, especially when you look at emotional abuse and emotional neglect. Those factors have gone up significantly across a lot of sectors. So is that rose-colored glasses at work? Is there something else happening? Everything is just hypothesis and inference other than the actual data itself.
Dana asked, will you be sharing infographics that we could present to leadership in international schools to encourage them to pay for the research? This is so important.
Yep.
The short
Yes,
answer is yes. And again, we will also be releasing a lot more information through white papers, through other articles and other avenues. And yes, we want to get this information.
One of the things we plan to do moving forward is to be writing articles, blog posts, whatever, that are specific to certain sectors, because we've got specific information. To be able to write something that's specifically all about the data for international school attendees, for military kids, for business kids, for boarding school kids, whatever it is, be able to get specific data for specific things and write about that, have infographics about that will be more shareable for whatever specific audience you're trying to advocate with.
Lisa asked
the ACEs test. Yes, I'll do that.
Lisa asked if there's any way to distinguish Latin American based TCKs from the majority group. We do not have a way to do that with the way that we collected the data. Our data was all inclusive as far as we didn't just look at American based TCKs, they were global TCKs, but we cannot, with the results that we have from this study, parcel out South American based TCKs. Etty, we would love that if you would be interested in collaborating with us on a post on that. Thank you, John and Lauren, for your kind comments.
Lauren, there's a comment about the Christianity Today article. Did you want to address that one?
Oh, that's a great question. I will carefully address that one. The Christianity Today article presented the research factually. There was nothing that was untrue about what they said. Also, articles try to make a point, right? That's kind of the purpose of writing an article. And so while there was nothing untrue, And I actually did send an email after it was first published, about 10 minutes. So if you read it in the first 10 minutes, go read it again. But about 10 minutes after it came out on the internet, I sent an email to the editor and said, hey, there are a couple of things on here that are not true. And she emailed me back about 5 minutes later and said, we fixed it. It's fixed on the site, which I thought was an incredible amount of due diligence for them to automatically fix those things. So I will say there was nothing untrue, but articles are made to make a point. And so there is that perspective as well. And you can take that as you would like to. The article is linked in the chat if you are interested in looking at that and reading it.
Yeah, they interviewed Lauren and shared a couple of stats from this research.
With our permission. They had permission to share those. Yeah. One thing that we have to know and hold loosely is the fact that we can provide this research, we can provide this data, and we cannot control how people use it. And that is a bit scary. We cannot police everybody who uses this data to make sure that they are presenting it and saying it in a way that we want them to, that provides hope for the TCK community. And so we are aware of that. And we feel like this is important enough research and information that we don't want to police it so much that it can't be used. But we do understand that that is something that is a potential concern.
There's a great question here saying, is there a chance that there is a significant number of TCKs who have more trauma that did not answer the survey because the connections were with TCKs who want to identify that way as an adult on social media, who are paying attention to those topics? TCKs with more trauma may not have wanted to answer the survey or have stayed out of those communities. Yeah, absolutely. Also, the fact that we had lots of warnings on there, you know, if this is going to be damaging to your mental health, like, you don't need to do this. You don't need to take this take this survey. We can't force people, and we don't want to impose on people who have experienced significant trauma. So I think it's fair to say, yeah, maybe the numbers are higher, but maybe the numbers are lower as well. Maybe people who had really great experiences don't feel the need to take a survey on developmental trauma. I think it probably balances out a bit as well. You know, we can't say one way or the other. All we can say is this is what we got from 1,900 people. Yeah. Everything else is speculation. But yeah, it's quite possible that people with significant trauma didn't take it. But we can look at those numbers and go, there's a significant number of people who did have significant trauma who did take it. Yeah.
Yes. Well, thank you so much for being here today. We are out of time, and I want to respect the time that you've already given to this. We again have the methodology report up on the website. You are welcome to reach out if you have any other questions. We will be taking any of the questions that were not answered live and answering those and sending them out in an email. The recording will be going out. We will be making sure that you are communicated with about this research. We have worked really hard on it, as I hope you can see, and we've been really intentional about how that's been done. And so we want to continue to provide excellent research-based care and resources through this and help you do the same. So thank you so much for being here.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you for your amazing questions and comments. And yeah, we look forward to continuing to connect with you and produce more statistics and written resources for you about this research.
We will stay on until everyone leaves in case there's any final questions or comments that you'd like to put in the chat. Thanks, Paula. Thanks, Mom. All right, everyone is out. You can stop recording. I realized I don't have control over anything, Elizabeth.
Yeah, let me stop recording.